The axe came down crooked. Mara felt the jolt up through her shoulders, into her spine, rattling teeth that already ached from the cold. The log didn't split. It sat there, mocking her, the blade wedged halfway through like a broken promise. She yanked the handle, stumbling back, breath coming out in short white bursts that vanished into the November air. Her hands were bleeding again. The blisters had opened days ago and she'd wrapped them in torn muslin, but the fabric was stiff now, with dried blood and dirt. She wiped her palms on her skirt, already filthy, already beyond saving, and gripped the axe again. One more try. The blade bit deep this time, and the wood gave with a crack that sounded too much like bone. She caught herself against the stump, dizzy, the world tilting just enough to remind her she hadn't eaten since yesterday. Or was it the day before? Time moved differently when you were alone, when you were losing. She split 3 more pieces before her arms quit. Not enough. Nowhere near enough. The woodpile was a joke, a sad, pathetic stack that wouldn't last a week once the real cold came. And it was coming. She could smell it in the air, taste it on the wind that cut down from the high peaks and turned her breath to frost. Mara straightened, pushing damp hair off her forehead with the back of one ruined hand. The ranch spread out around her in shades of brown and gray, dead grass, bare trees, a sky the color of old iron. The barn sagged to one side, missing shingles like missing teeth. The fence line had gaps a child could walk through. The creek that used to run clear and cold had slowed to a trickle, choked with silt and dying brush. 16 months ago, this place had been alive. Hard, yes. Unforgiving, always. But alive. Thomas had kept it running through sheer stubborn will, the same will that got him killed when his horse spooked at a rattler and threw him into a rock slide. She'd found him 3 hours later, still breathing but not conscious, his leg bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. He died that night in their bed, holding her hand, trying to say her name. She'd buried him herself, dug the hole in ground so hard it bent the shovel, wrapped him in the good quilt her mother made, said words she didn't believe over a grave that wasn't deep enough. And then she'd tried to keep going. Tried and failed. The cattle got sick first, some fever that tore through the small herd like wildfire, leaving her with 2 skinny cows and a bull too mean to die. She sold the cows for almost nothing just to buy seed for the spring planting, but the rain never came. The crops withered, the well dropped so low she had to drop the bucket twice to get enough for cooking. The neighbors, the few who lived close enough to call neighbors, stopped coming by. Stopped offering help. A widow alone was bad luck. A failing widow was worse. She was 26 years old and she was dying by degrees. Mara hauled the split wood to the porch, her boots crunching through frost that hadn't melted all day. Inside, the cabin was barely warmer than outside. The stove was cold. She'd been rationing the wood, rationing everything, and now she was paying for it. She dumped the logs by the hearth and stood there, staring at the blackened iron, trying to decide if it was worth the effort. A sound outside stopped her. Hoofbeats. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't seen another soul in 2 weeks. Whoever it was, they weren't here for a social call. Mara grabbed the rifle from above the door, Thomas's rifle, old and heavy, and probably not even loaded, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a fist. She raised the gun, trying to look steady, trying not to shake. A man rode into her yard. He was big. That was the first thing she noticed, tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a heavy coat that made him look even larger. His horse was a massive roan gelding, well-fed, well-kept, the kind of horse you didn't see much anymore. The man himself had dark hair going gray at the temples, a hard jaw, eyes that caught the flat afternoon light and gave nothing back. He stopped 10 feet from her porch and looked at her. Just looked. Mara tightened her grip on the rifle. State your business. His gaze flicked to the gun, then back to her face. No fear, no concern. You Mara Vance? Her pulse kicked. Who's asking? Gideon Hale. I own the land north of here, the big spread past Crowley's Ridge. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Hale ran cattle, a lot of them, and he ran them well. People said he was fair but ruthless. Paid his hands on time and fired them without hesitation. Kept to himself mostly. No wife, no family anyone knew about. She'd never met him, never expected to. What do you want? He dismounted. Smooth, controlled, like a man who'd spent his whole life on horseback. He didn't come closer, just stood there holding the reins, looking at her porch, her woodpile, her sagging barn, taking inventory. Heard your husband died. Her jaw clenched. 1.5 years ago. Heard you've been managing alone. Managing fine. His eyes moved over her face, her hands, her threadbare coat. She felt stripped bare under that gaze, every failure visible. He didn't argue with her, didn't need to. I'll be direct, he said. You're not going to make it through winter. Heat flooded her cheeks. You don't know? I do know. I've seen enough failing homesteads to recognize one. You're out of livestock, out of stores, out of time. Another month and you'll be frozen or starved or both. Get off my land. He didn't move. I have a proposition. I'm not interested in anything you're selling. I'm not selling, I'm offering. He paused, weighing his words. Marry me. The world stopped. Mara stared at him, sure she'd misheard, sure the cold had finally gotten into her brain and scrambled it. What? Marry me, he repeated, calm as if he'd offered to buy her firewood. I'll take care of this place, consolidate it with mine. You'll have food, shelter, security, a future. You're insane. I'm practical. You don't even know me. I know enough. You're a hard worker. Anyone who's lasted this long alone is. You're not afraid of difficulty, and you need help whether you'll admit it or not. She stepped forward, fury burning through the shock. I don't need a stranger riding onto my land telling me what I need. Then what do you need? His voice didn't rise, but something sharpened in it. Another winter like this one? Another year scraping by until there's nothing left to scrape? Better than selling myself to some... I'm not asking you to sell anything. He cut her off, still controlled, still steady. This isn't about romance, Mrs. Vance. It's about survival. You need resources. I need... He hesitated just for a second. I need a wife, a partner, someone capable. It's a fair trade. Why me? Because you're strong enough to last this long and smart enough to know you can't last much longer. And because I think we could build something that works. That's more than most marriages start with. Mara's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the rifle. Get out! Gideon Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, mounted his horse with that same easy grace, and turned to go. He stopped at the edge of her property. I'll give you 3 days to think about it, he called back. After that, the offer expires. I'm not a man who waits around. Then he rode off, disappearing into the gray-brown landscape like he'd never been there at all. Mara stood on her porch until the cold drove her inside. She put the rifle back, built a fire she couldn't afford, and sat in front of it staring at the flames. Marry a stranger, give up everything Thomas built, admit defeat. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn, whispering through the gaps in the walls. She pulled Thomas's old coat around her shoulders, still smelling faintly of him, of sweat and leather and the tobacco he used to chew, and closed her eyes. 3 days. The next morning, she woke to frost on the inside of the windows. Her breath made clouds in the cabin air. The fire had died overnight, and she'd been too exhausted to wake up and feed it. Now she lay under 2 blankets and Thomas's coat, shivering, trying to find the will to move. She thought about Gideon Hale's offer. She thought about dying alone. She thought about how much Thomas would hate seeing her like this, broken, failing, giving up piece by piece. Mara forced herself out of bed. The floor was ice under her bare feet. She dressed in layers, wrapped her hands in fresh cloth, pulled on her boots. Outside, the world was white with frost, every surface glittering in the weak morning light. She fed the bull, the last animal she had left, and mucked out his stall. She hauled water from the well, arms screaming, and patched another hole in the barn wall with scrap wood and bent nails. She split more wood, though her hands bled through the wrappings. She did everything she'd done every day for 16 months, and it still wasn't enough. By afternoon, she was sitting on the porch steps, too tired to go back inside, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. The sky was doing something beautiful, layers of orange and pink and deep purple, but she couldn't appreciate it. Beauty didn't fill your stomach, didn't keep you warm. A rider appeared on the road. Not Gideon this time, someone smaller, older. As they got closer, she recognized Calvin Marsh, who ran the general store in town, 15 miles south. He pulled up, tipped his hat. Mrs. Vance. Mr. Marsh. He looked uncomfortable. I hate to come out here like this, but, well, you haven't been to town in a while, and there's the matter of your account. Her chest tightened. I'll settle it soon. That's what you said last time, and the time before. He wouldn't meet her eyes. I've got a business to run, ma'am. I can't keep extending credit to folks who can't pay. I'll pay. I just need... You've needed for 6 months now. His voice was gentle but firm. I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance, I truly am, but I can't give you anything more until the account's settled, and... He paused, unhappy. I'm going to need at least half of what's owed by the end of the month. Otherwise, I'll have to take it to the county. The end of the month. 2 weeks. She owed him $43. She had maybe 12 to her name, hidden in a can under the floorboards. There was no way to make up the difference. No crop to sell. No animals. Nothing. I understand, she heard herself say. Marsh looked relieved. He tipped his hat again, offered some platitude about hoping things turned around, and left. Mara sat very still. The sun finished setting. The cold came down hard. She went inside, lit a candle, rationing the kerosene now too, and stared at the flame. Gideon Hale's words came back to her. Another year scraping by until there's nothing left to scrape. She pulled out the can from under the floor, counted the money for the 10th time, came up with the same impossible number. $12.30. Not enough to pay Marsh. Not enough to buy supplies for winter. Not enough for anything. She thought about what it meant to lose the land. Where would she go? The nearest city was 100 miles away. She had no family left. No skills except farming and ranching, and who would hire a woman for that? She'd end up in some boarding house, working as a laundress or a cook if she was lucky, sleeping in a room with 5 other women, eating scraps. Or she'd end up worse. Mara blew out the candle, sat in the dark. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned, the children they'd wanted, the dreams that died with him in that too shallow grave. She thought about the promise she'd made standing over his body, that she'd keep the ranch going, that she'd honor what he built. But Thomas was dead, and she was so tired. When she finally slept, she dreamed of winter, of snow piling up against the door, the cold seeping through the walls, her breath slowing, stopping, of being found in the spring, frozen in her bed, another cautionary tale for the women in town to whisper about. She woke before dawn, made her decision. Gideon Hale lived in a house made of stone. It took her 4 hours to ride there. Her old mare was slow, half lame, barely fit for the journey, and by the time she arrived, the sun was high and cold. The house sat at the base of a long valley, 2 stories, solid, with a wide porch and real glass windows. The barn behind it was bigger than her entire cabin. Cattle dotted the hillsides more than she could count. A man met her at the gate. One of Hale's hands, she guessed. He looked her over with undisguised curiosity. I need to see Mr. Hale, she said. He expecting you? No. The hand considered this, then shrugged. Wait here. He disappeared into the house. Mara sat on her tired horse, feeling small and exposed. Other men were working nearby, repairing fence, moving hay, doing all the things she couldn't do alone anymore. They glanced at her, looked away. Word would spread fast. Widow Vance, come begging. Let them talk. Gideon emerged from the house, still wearing work clothes, sleeves rolled up despite the cold. He saw her and went still for just a moment. Then he came down the porch steps, crossed the yard, stood next to her horse. Mrs. Vance, Mr. Hale. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Your offer, does it still stand? His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. It does. I have conditions. I'm listening. She forced herself to look at him directly. I keep my own name. The ranch stays in my name too, in the deed. If anything happens to you, it comes back to me. Agreed. I'm not... She stopped, heat rising in her face. I need time. Before we're really married, as man and wife. He nodded slowly. How much time? I don't know, however long it takes. That's acceptable. She'd expected argument. The lack of it threw her. That's all? You're not livestock, Mrs. Vance. I'm not going to force anything. He paused. But I do want honesty between us. And I do want a real marriage, eventually. A family. Can you agree to that? A family, children, everything she'd wanted with Thomas and never gotten. Yes, she whispered. Then we have a deal. He held up a hand. Come down from there. Let's talk details inside where it's warm. She dismounted, legs shaking from the long ride and the weight of what she'd just done. Gideon called to one of his men to take care of her horse, then led her into the house. Inside was a revelation. Warm air, wood floors, furniture that wasn't broken or patched, a kitchen with an actual stove, a pump right inside for water, shelves stocked with food, flour, sugar, coffee, things she hadn't seen in months. It smelled like bread and wood smoke and safety. Gideon pulled out a chair at a large table. Sit. She sat. He poured coffee from a pot on the stove, set a cup in front of her, then sat across from her. We'll do this properly. I'll ride into town tomorrow, talk to the preacher. We can marry by the end of the week if that suits you. That fast? No point waiting. Winter's not going to hold off for ceremony. He sipped his coffee. You'll move your things here. Whatever you want to bring. I'll send men to help. What about my ranch? We'll keep it running, consolidate the herds, use your land for grazing. In spring, we'll see what can be salvaged, what should be rebuilt. He looked at her steadily. I meant what I said. This is a partnership. I'm not looking to erase what your husband built. Thomas's name hung in the air between them. I loved him, Mara said quietly. I know. I'm not over him. I don't know if I'll ever be. I'm not asking you to be. Gideon's voice was firm, but not unkind. I'm asking you to be practical, to survive. The rest we'll figure out as we go. She looked at this stranger across the table, this hard, weathered man who'd ridden onto her failing land and offered her a lifeline when no one else would. She didn't love him, didn't even know him, but he was offering her something she desperately needed, a future. Okay, she said. End of the week. Gideon nodded. We'll make it work, Mrs. Vance. I promise you that. She almost believed him. They married on a Thursday. The ceremony was short, functional, witnessed by the preacher and two of Gideon's ranch hands. Mara wore the only decent dress she owned, cleaned and mended. Gideon wore a suit that looked uncomfortable on his broad frame. They spoke vows that felt hollow in her mouth, promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The preacher pronounced them married. Gideon didn't kiss her, just took her hand, squeezed it once, and led her out into the cold afternoon. That night he gave her the main bedroom and took the smaller room down the hall. She lay in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house that wasn't hers, married to a man who wasn't hers, and tried not to cry. She failed. The next morning she woke to the smell of bacon. Gideon was at the stove cooking breakfast like it was the most natural thing in the world. He glanced at her when she came into the kitchen, nodded toward the table. Coffee's hot. She poured herself a cup, sat down. He brought over a plate, eggs, bacon, bread with butter. Real butter. More food than she'd seen in weeks. Eat, he said. It wasn't a command, just a statement. She ate. She couldn't help herself. Her body was starving and the food was there, and she couldn't pretend anymore that she didn't need it. Gideon ate across from her, silent. When they finished, he stood, brought his plate to the basin. I've got work to do. You can settle in, look around, do whatever you need. If you want to help, there's mending that needs doing, but you don't have to. I want to help. He looked at her, something like approval in his eyes. Mending's in the basket by the fireplace. Then he left. Mara sat alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to the sounds of the ranch outside. Men calling to each other, cattle lowing, the rhythmic thunk of an axe on wood. Normal sounds, working sounds. She found the mending basket. It was overflowing, torn shirts, pants with holes, socks worn through. Evidence of a man living alone, letting things pile up because there was no one to take care of them. She could do this. This at least she knew how to do. Mara spent the day sewing. Her hands, still damaged from weeks of hard labor, protested at first, but the familiar motion soothed her. Stitch by stitch, she repaired what was broken. It felt like something. Gideon came in at dusk. He looked at the neat stack of mended clothes, then at her. "Thank you." "It's nothing. It's not nothing." He washed his hands at the pump. "I'll make dinner. I can cook." "Not tonight. You've done enough." They ate together again, beef stew thick with vegetables she hadn't tasted in months. She wanted to eat slowly, savor it, but her body had other ideas. She finished everything, sopping up the last of the gravy with bread. Gideon watched her, not judging, just observing. "Better?" he asked. "Yes." The word caught in her throat. "Thank you." "You don't have to keep thanking me. This is your home now." Your home, not ours. Hers. She didn't know what to do with that. That night he went to his room again without discussion. She lay in the big bed, full and warm for the first time in longer than she could remember, and felt the tears come again. But this time they weren't all grief. Days became a week became 2. Mara found her rhythm. She cooked, cleaned, mended, did all the things a ranch wife was supposed to do. Gideon worked from dawn to dusk, managing his men, tending the herd, fixing what needed fixing. They ate together, talked about practical things, supplies needed, weather coming, work to be done. He never pushed her, never demanded more than she could give. At night, they went to separate rooms. The arrangement should have felt wrong. It should have felt like failure, but mostly it just felt safe. 3 weeks after the wedding, the first real snow came. Mara woke to find the world transformed, everything white and soft and quiet. She stood at the window watching it fall, remembering how beautiful she used to find winter, before it became something to fear. Gideon came up behind her. She felt his presence before she heard him. "You all right?" "Just watching the snow." He stood next to her, looking out. "Used to love it when I was a kid. Seemed magical. And now? Now it's just weather." He glanced at her. "But I'm glad you're here to see it." Something in his voice made her turn. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not desire exactly, but something warmer than the careful neutrality he usually maintained. "Gideon, I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm glad you're here. That's all." He left before she could respond. Mara stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow cover the world, thinking about the man she'd married and how little she understood him. Yes, December came hard. The temperature dropped until even inside the house, their breath showed in the mornings. The ranch hands moved like shadows through the white landscape, tending cattle that huddled together for warmth. Gideon worked harder than anyone, up before dawn, not stopping until dark. Mara kept the house running, cooked meals that could stretch, that would fill bellies and warm bones, washed clothes in water she had to heat on the stove because the pump froze, kept the fires going, small things, necessary things. One night, Gideon came in late, covered in snow, exhausted. She had stew waiting. He ate without speaking, barely tasting it. "One of the cows got stuck in a drift," he said finally. "Took 3 of us 2 hours to dig her out. Is she all right?" "Lost the calf she was carrying, but she'll live." Mara refilled his bowl. "You need to rest." "Can't. Too much to do." "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." He looked at her, surprised. "You worried about me, Mrs. Vance?" The question caught her off guard. Was she? When had that happened? "You're my husband," she said carefully. "Of course I'm worried." Something shifted in his expression. "Mara." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "You don't have to call me Mrs. Vance anymore. We're past that." "All right." He finished his stew, stood. "Thank you. For dinner. For—" He gestured vaguely, seemed to run out of words. "It's what wives do," she said, then immediately regretted it. Gideon smiled, a rare, brief thing that changed his whole face. "Still, thank you." That night, Lying in bed, Mara realized she'd stopped thinking about the marriage as temporary, stopped seeing it as just survival. Something had shifted without her noticing, and she wasn't sure what to do about it. Christmas came without celebration. Gideon didn't seem to expect it, and Mara didn't have the energy to create it from nothing. They worked through the day like any other, though she made a better dinner: roast chicken, potatoes, the last of the preserves from summer. Over dinner, Gideon pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I know we didn't talk about gifts," he said, almost sheepish, "but I saw this in town and thought—" She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of gloves, real leather, lined with fleece, far nicer than anything she'd owned. "Your hands," he said. "They're always cold." I thought. Mara looked at the gloves, at this man who'd noticed her cold hands, who'd thought about her comfort. Her throat felt tight. "I didn't get you anything." "You've given me plenty." He said it simply, like a fact. She tried on the gloves. They fit perfectly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Merry Christmas, Mara." It was the best gift she'd received in years. January brought a thaw, then another freeze that was worse than the first. 2 of the ranch hands quit, said they were heading south where the work wasn't so brutal. Gideon let them go without argument, spread their work among the men who stayed. Mara watched him carry more and more weight, saw the exhaustion building. One morning, she found him at the kitchen table before dawn, head in his hands. "What's wrong?" He looked up, startled. "Nothing, just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated. "Money. We're burning through winter stores faster than I planned. If this cold keeps up, I might have to sell some cattle early, take a loss." She sat down across from him. "How bad?" "Not catastrophic, just not good." This was her fault too, she realized. Her ranch, her debts, everything she'd brought to this marriage. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For being another burden." Gideon's eyes sharpened. "You're not a burden. Don't ever think that." "But I cost you. You cost me nothing I wasn't willing to pay, and you've given back more than you know." He reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "We're in this together, remember?" His hand was warm, calloused, solid. She should pull away, maintain distance, but she didn't want to. "Together," she agreed softly. He squeezed her hand once, then let go. But something had been said, something neither of them could take back. The winter stretched on. They worked. They survived. And slowly, inevitably, they grew closer. Mara found herself looking for Gideon when he was late coming in, found herself cooking things he liked, mending his clothes with extra care, found herself talking more at dinner, sharing memories of her life before Thomas died, even laughing occasionally at something Gideon said. And Gideon, solid, stoic Gideon, softened around her, smiled more, touched her shoulder in passing, asked her opinion on ranch decisions, then actually listened to her answers. One night in late February, a blizzard hit with a violence that shook the house. The wind screamed, snow piled against the windows. Mara sat by the fire, trying not to show her fear, while Gideon checked every window, every door, making sure they were secure. "It's bad out there," he said, coming back to the fire. "Will the cattle be all right?" "They're in the shelter of the valley. They'll manage." He sat next to her, closer than usual. "We're safe here." A particularly strong gust hit the house. Mara flinched. Without thinking, Gideon put his arm around her. She froze. He started to pull back. "Don't," she said quietly. He stilled. Then slowly he drew her closer. She leaned into him, feeling his warmth, his solidity. They sat like that while the storm raged outside, not speaking, just being. When Mara finally went to bed that night, she lay awake for hours, feeling the ghost of his arm around her, wondering when this practical arrangement had become something else entirely. March came with mud and promise. The snow began to melt. Green showed through in sheltered spots. The cattle, thin but alive, started moving toward the better grass. Gideon took stock of what they'd lost, fewer than he'd feared, and started planning for spring. And Mara realized with a start that she'd made it. She'd survived the winter. Not alone, not barely, but actually survived. One afternoon, she rode out to her old ranch. Gideon had sent men to keep the worst in repair, but it still looked abandoned, sad. The cabin she'd shared with Thomas sat empty, windows dark. She should feel grief, should feel like she'd betrayed him. Instead, she just felt tired and ready to let go. Gideon found her there at sunset. He rode up slowly, dismounted, stood next to her looking at the old place. "Thinking about moving back?" he asked, tone light but with something careful underneath. "No." The answer surprised her with its certainty. "This isn't home anymore." He looked at her. "What is?" She met his eyes. "Your house. Our house." The words hung between them. "Mara," he said, and there was something raw in his voice. "I need to tell you something." "What?" "This arrangement, this marriage, it started practical, and maybe that's all it was supposed to be." He took a breath. "But somewhere along the way, I started wanting more. Wanting you. Not just as a wife on paper, but as mine." Her heart hammered. "Gideon, you don't have to say anything. I know you're not ready. I know you might never be ready, but I needed you to know." He turned to go. Mara caught his arm. He stopped. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to explain that she'd been feeling the same pull, the same shift. That when he touched her now, she didn't flinch. That she'd started to imagine a future that included him, really him, not just survival. "I'm not ready," she said finally, "but I'm getting there." He turned back to face her, hope naked on his weathered face. "How much time do you need?" "I don't know, but—" She forced herself to be honest. "But I want to try, to make this real." Gideon's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then we'll try," he said, "however long it takes." He took her hand, and they stood together watching the sunset over the land that was becoming theirs. Not his, not hers, but theirs together. And for the first time since Thomas died, Mara felt something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt hope. Spring came slowly, like it was testing the ground first. The mud was everywhere, thick, sucking, impossible. It clung to boots, to wagon wheels, to the hooves of horses that picked their way carefully through the thawing ranch. Mara spent half her days just trying to keep the house clean, fighting a losing battle against the dirt that came in on every pair of boots, tracked across every floor she'd just scrubbed. But with the mud came life. Green shoots pushed through the brown earth. The creek that had been frozen solid began to run again, clear and cold and loud. Birds returned, filling the mornings with sound. The cattle spread out across the valley, no longer huddled against the cold, their coats already starting to shed the winter thickness. Gideon was everywhere at once. Calving season hit hard and fast, and he barely slept, out at all hours checking on cows in labor, pulling calves when they came wrong, doctoring the ones that got sick. Mara watched him come in at dawn with blood on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. Eat whatever she put in front of him without tasting it, then head back out. She tried to help where she could, brought hot coffee to the men working the birthing barn. Took over the bookkeeping so Gideon had one less thing to worry about. Started a garden behind the house, turning over soil that hadn't been worked in years, planting seeds she'd ordered from the catalog with money Gideon had given her without question. They still slept in separate rooms, but the distance felt different now, less like a wall and more like a door that just hadn't been opened yet. One morning in late April, Mara woke to shouting. She threw on her robe and ran outside to find chaos. One of the new calves had gotten into the grain store and gorged itself sick. The calf was down, bloated, making horrible sounds. Gideon and two of his men were trying to get it on its feet. "We need to walk it," Gideon was saying, voice tight with controlled panic. "Keep it moving or it'll die." Mara ran back inside, grabbed her coat and boots, came back out. "What can I do?" Gideon looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "Get the mineral oil from the barn, the big jug, and a length of rubber tubing." She ran, found what he needed, brought it back, watched as Gideon forced the tube down the calf's throat, poured oil in to try to ease the bloat. The calf kicked, fought. One hoof caught Gideon in the ribs, and he grunted but didn't let go. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on, you stubborn bastard." The calf's mother circled them, bawling frantically. Mara moved without thinking, putting herself between the cow and Gideon. Easy, she said softly. Easy, Mama. We're helping. The cow tossed her head but didn't charge. They worked for an hour, walking the calf, massaging its swollen belly, waiting for the oil to work. Mara's arms ached, her back screamed, but she didn't stop. Finally, the calf belched, a huge wet sound, and started to deflate. Gideon sat back on his heels, breathing hard. That's it, that's it. The calf staggered to its mother and began to nurse, weak but alive. One of the ranch hands let out a whoop. The other slapped Gideon on the shoulder. Thought we'd lost that one for sure, boss. Gideon stood slowly, wincing. He looked at Mara. Thank you. I didn't do much. You did plenty. He touched her arm briefly. You're good with them, the cattle. She thought about all the years she'd worked alongside Thomas, doing exactly this kind of thing. Skills she'd almost forgotten she had. I used to be. You still are. It felt like more than a compliment. It felt like recognition. That afternoon, Gideon came inside while she was making bread. He stood in the doorway watching her work the dough. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About the partnership, this marriage. He came closer. I said we'd figure it out as we go, and I meant it. But I also think you should have a real say in the ranch, not just the house, everything. Mara's hand stilled. What do you mean? I mean decisions. Buying cattle, selling them, where we graze, how we manage. You know this work. You're good at it, and it's not fair to shut you out just because that's how things are usually done. She'd never expected this. Most men wouldn't even consider it. You're serious? Completely. He leaned against the counter. Tomorrow we're moving the herd to the north pasture. Come with me. Look at the grass. Tell me what you think. I trust your judgment. Something warm bloomed in her chest. Trust. He was offering her trust. All right, Yi, she said. I'll come. They rode out the next day, just the two of them. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of day that made you remember why people chose this life despite everything. The north pasture spread out before them, rolling hills covered in new grass that moved like water in the wind. Gideon brought his horse alongside hers. What do you see? Mara studied the land with eyes she'd trained on her own failed ranch. Good grass, but thin in patches. See there? She pointed. That's where runoff washed it out last year. You'll want to keep the herd moving, not let them graze it down to nothing. Agreed. What else? The creek's high now, but come summer it'll drop. You'll need to make sure they can get to the water that's left. And watch that stand of cottonwoods. Looks like there might be poison oak mixed in. Gideon was smiling. See? This is exactly what I needed. They spent the morning riding the pasture, talking through plans. It felt natural, easy, like they'd been doing this together for years instead of months. Mara found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since Thomas died. This was work she understood, work she was good at. At noon, they stopped by the creek to water the horses. Gideon pulled out the lunch she'd packed, bread, cheese, hard-boiled eggs. They sat on sun-warmed rocks and ate. Can I ask you something? Gideon said after a while. Sure. Do you still think about him? Your first husband? The question should have hurt. Instead, it just felt honest. Every day, Mara said. But different now. Less like grief and more like, memory. Does that make sense? It does. He was quiet for a moment. I was married before, too. Did you know that? She hadn't. What happened? Sarah. We married young, barely 20. She died in childbirth 3 years later. The baby, too. His voice was steady, but there was old pain underneath. I thought I'd never want that again. A wife. Children. The risk of losing them. What changed? He looked at her. You did. Somewhere between that first day I rode onto your land and now I realized I was just existing, not living, and I didn't want to exist anymore. Mara's throat felt tight. I'm not her. I know. I don't want you to be. He turned to face her fully. I want you to be you, complicated, stubborn, strong, That's what I want. She didn't know what to say, didn't trust her voice. Gideon reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered. I meant what I said before. I'll wait as long as you need. But I want you to know, I'm not going anywhere. This isn't temporary for me anymore. It's not temporary for me either, she whispered. He leaned in, stopped just short, waiting. Mara closed the distance. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing like the desperate passion she'd known with Thomas. This was different, careful, a beginning instead of a continuation. When they pulled apart, Gideon was smiling. About time, he said. She laughed, actually laughed, and felt something inside her chest loosen. They rode back to the ranch, holding hands like courting teenagers, and Mara didn't care who saw. But spring's promises came with complications. A week later, a rider arrived carrying mail. Most of it was the usual: supply catalogs, a letter from one of Gideon's cousins in Montana. But there was also an official-looking envelope addressed to Mara Vance. Not Mara Hale. Vance. She opened it with fingers that had started to shake before she knew why. Inside was a letter from a lawyer's office in Denver. Words jumped out at her. Outstanding debt, legal obligation, payment required, foreclosure proceedings. Her old ranch. The money she'd owed before marrying Gideon. $43 to the general store, but apparently there was more. A loan Thomas had taken out 2 years ago to buy cattle. A loan Mara had forgotten about in the chaos of his death and her struggle to survive. The balance was $375. She read the letter 3 times, each time hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. Gideon found her at the kitchen table. The letter spread in front of her, her face bloodless. What's wrong? She couldn't speak, just pushed the letter toward him. He read it, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set it down carefully, too carefully. How long have you known about this? I swear, I didn't know about this loan. Thomas must have... She stopped. I don't know. After he died, I was so focused on just surviving day to day. Bills came and I paid what I could. I must have missed this somehow. $375. Gideon's voice was flat. Plus interest. They're demanding payment in full within 30 days or they'll take the land. Your land, Mara said. It's in my name, but we're married, so legally, it's your land. The deed is yours. We agreed to that. He stood, paced to the window. But if they take it, they take the grazing rights, the water access. Half my spring plan depends on using that land. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have been more careful. I should have... Stop. He turned to face her. This isn't your fault. You were drowning and trying not to go under. I understand that. But what do we do? Gideon was quiet for a long time. I'll pay it. You can't. I'll pay it, he repeated, harder. We just got through winter. I sold some cattle early, remember? The money's tight, but it's there. I'll wire it to Denver tomorrow. Gideon, that's nearly everything you made. You were going to use that to buy breeding stock, to invest in the future. And this ranch, your ranch, is part of that future. He came back to the table, took her hands. We're partners. Your debts are my debts. Your problems are my problems. That's what this means. Mara felt tears burning. I brought you nothing but trouble. You brought me everything. He squeezed her hands. We'll figure this out. We always do. But that night, lying awake in her room, Mara couldn't shake the guilt. $375. Money they desperately needed. Money that would have bought calves, supplies, security. Gone because of her dead husband's choices and her own negligence. She heard Gideon moving around in his room. He couldn't sleep either. She thought about the kiss by the creek, about the partnership they'd been building, about how she'd finally started to believe they could make this work. And now this. Gideon rode to town the next morning. When he came back, his face was grim. It's done. Money's wired. Thank you. Don't thank me. He dismounted, started to lead his horse to the barn. Gideon, I need to work, Mara. I need to work. He was angry. Not at her exactly, but angry. At the situation, at the unfairness of it, at how hard they'd fought only to have this dropped on them. She understood. She was angry too. The days that followed were tense. They were polite to each other, careful, but the ease they'd found was gone. Gideon worked longer hours. Mara threw herself into the garden, the house, anything to avoid sitting still with her guilt. At night, she lay awake and thought about how one piece of paper had undone months of progress. A week later, another letter came. This one was from the same law office. Mara opened it with dread coiled in her stomach. It was a receipt. Confirmation that payment had been received. The debt was cleared, the land was safe. But there was a second page. She read it again, felt the room start to spin. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Gideon came in from the barn. "What is it?" She couldn't look at him. "The debt. It wasn't real." "What?" "The loan. Thomas never took out a loan for $375. Someone forged the documents, created a fake debt to try to steal the land." The silence was deafening. "Who?" Gideon's voice was deadly quiet. Mara looked at the signature on the bottom of the second letter, from a different lawyer, one in the county seat. A man named Carson Briggs. He's a land speculator. Apparently he's been doing this to widows and struggling homesteaders all over the territory, creating fake debts, then buying the land for nothing when they can't pay. And we just gave him $375. The lawyer in the county seat, the legitimate one, says we can file charges, try to get the money back, but it could take months, years even, and there's no guarantee. Gideon slammed his fist on the table. The coffee cups jumped. Mara flinched. He saw it, and the anger drained from his face. "I'm sorry. I'm not angry at you. You should be. If I'd been more careful, if I'd checked the records, verified, how could you have known? You can barely read legal documents. Hell, I can barely read legal documents." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "This Briggs, where is he? According to this, he's in Denver. Then I'm going to Denver." "What? No! Gideon, you can't just watch me." His eyes were hard. "He stole from us, from you. I'm not going to let that stand. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to do something." He left the next morning. Mara stood on the porch and watched him ride away, a cold knot of fear in her chest. She knew that look in his eyes. That was a man who'd been pushed too far. She spent the next 3 days trying to keep the ranch running. The hands looked to her for direction, and she gave it, falling back on skills she'd honed with Thomas. Check the fences, move the cattle, keep an eye on the pregnant cows. Normal work, steady work. But at night, alone in the big house, she couldn't stop imagining what Gideon might do. What might happen to him? On the 4th day, he came back. He looked exhausted, dirty, but there was something satisfied in his expression. "What did you do?" Mara asked. "Had a conversation with Mr. Briggs." "What kind of conversation?" Gideon smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. "The kind where I explained that if he didn't return our money and cease all operations in this territory, I'd make sure every newspaper between here and Denver knew exactly what he'd been doing, and that I'd personally visit every single family he'd defrauded and help them file charges." "And he agreed?" "He agreed, reluctantly." Gideon pulled an envelope from his coat. "Here, $375, counted it myself." Mara took the envelope with shaking hands. "How did you make him do it?" "I didn't make him do anything. I just encouraged him to see reason." He touched his knuckles, which Mara now noticed were bruised and split. "Vigorous encouragement. You hit him. I had a frank exchange of ideas with my fists." He met her eyes. The man was preying on people who couldn't defend themselves. Widows, families who'd lost everything. He deserved worse than what he got. Mara should have been appalled, should have lectured him about violence and the law. Instead, she felt something fierce and hot rise in her chest. She crossed the distance between them and kissed him hard. Gideon made a surprised sound, then kissed her back, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. This wasn't tentative like the first time. This was need and relief and something deeper. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon touched her face. "I won't let anyone hurt you, he said. "Not ever. I know. And I won't let you face things alone anymore. We're in this together, all of it. Together, she agreed. That night, for the first time, Mara went to his room instead of hers. She stood in the doorway, heart hammering. Gideon was sitting on the edge of his bed, pulling off his boots. He looked up, saw her, went very still. Mara? I don't want to sleep alone anymore. He stood slowly. You're sure? I'm sure. He crossed to her, cupped her face in his hands. We don't have to do anything. I'm happy just to... She kissed him to shut him up. What followed wasn't perfect. It was awkward in places, nervous, both of them out of practice and trying to learn each other. But it was real. And when Mara woke the next morning in Gideon's arms, sunlight streaming through the window, she felt something she hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. She felt whole. The days that followed were different, lighter somehow, despite the work, despite the lingering financial strain. They moved through the ranch as a true partnership now, making decisions together, working side by side. At night, they shared a bed, learning each other's bodies and hearts in the dark. But spring wasn't done testing them. In early June, they discovered one of the primary breeding cows was sick, some kind of infection that spread through her udder, making her unable to nurse. Gideon worked for days trying to save her, but in the end, she died, leaving behind a calf that now had to be bottle-fed every few hours. The calf became Mara's responsibility. She named him Stubborn, because that's what he was, and spent her days coaxing him to take the bottle, keeping him warm, making sure he didn't give up. Gideon found her in the barn one night, sitting in the straw with the calf curled against her, both of them half asleep. You're going to spoil him, Gideon said, but his voice was fond. He needs spoiling. He's had a rough start. Gideon sat down next to her. The calf shifted, pushed his nose against Mara's hand. She stroked his head absently. You're good with him, Gideon said. I like taking care of things. I've noticed. He was quiet for a moment. Mara, I want to talk to you about something. Her stomach tightened. What? A family, children. We talked about it before, but that was before. Before this became real. She knew this was coming, had been waiting for it, dreading it, and wanting it in equal measure. I want that too, she said softly. But I'm scared. Of what? Of failing. Of not being able to give you what you want. She took a breath. Thomas and I tried for 3 years. Nothing ever happened. What if it's me? What if I can't? Then we deal with it. Gideon took her hand. I'm not marrying you for children, Mara. I'm marrying you because I love you. It was the first time either of them had said it. Mara's eyes filled. You love me? I love you. Have for a while now, I think. Maybe since you showed up at my door and demanded conditions for marrying a stranger. He smiled. You're the strongest person I've ever met. And whatever happens, we face it together. That's enough for me. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't think I could feel this way again, but I do. They kissed there in the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and animals, the calf snoring softly against Mara's leg. It wasn't romantic by any conventional measure, but it was theirs. Summer arrived in full force. The days stretched long and hot. The garden exploded with growth. Tomatoes, squash, beans, more than Mara could have imagined. She spent hours canning, preserving, putting up stores for the next winter. The work was endless but satisfying. The ranch prospered too. The calves grew strong. The grass stayed thick despite the heat. Gideon made back the money they'd lost and then some, selling cattle at good prices to the railroad buyers who came through. But Mara's body remained stubbornly unchanged. Months passed. Nothing happened. She tried not to think about it, tried not to let the worry eat at her. But every month, when her bleeding came, she felt the failure a little deeper. Gideon never said anything, never complained. But she saw him watching the children when they went to town, saw the longing in his eyes, and felt her heart break a little. One night in August, she broke down. They were getting ready for bed, and she just couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears came hard and fast, ugly crying that shook her whole body. Gideon held her, confused. What's wrong? What happened? I can't, she sobbed. I can't give you a baby. It's been months and nothing's happening, and it's my fault. Something's wrong with me. Stop! Stop! He pulled back to look at her. Where's this coming from? I see how you look at other people's children. I know you want that, and I want to give it to you, but I can't, and I'm so sorry. Mara, listen to me. His voice was firm. I want children. Yes, I'm not going to lie about that, but I want you more. I need you to hear that. You are not failing me. You're not broken. And even if we never have children, you're enough. You're more than enough. But what if I am broken? Then we're broken together. He wiped her tears with his thumbs. And we make a life anyway. There are other ways. We could adopt. Or we could just be us. I married you, not the idea of you as a mother. I married Mara. Strong, stubborn, beautiful Mara who saved my life just as much as I saved hers. She clung to him, trying to believe it. Give it time, he said softly. We're still learning each other. There's no rush. But time felt like it was running out. Every day she got older. Every month that passed felt like another door closing. September came. The nights turned cool. They started preparing for winter again, cutting wood, checking the stores, making sure everything was secure. Mara threw herself into the work, trying to outrun the thoughts that chased her. And then, in early October, she woke up sick. At first she thought it was something she ate. Bad meat, maybe. But the sickness came back the next morning, and the next. She didn't let herself hope. Couldn't let herself hope. But when a week passed and the sickness continued, always in the morning, always fading by noon, she finally admitted what might be happening. She rode to town alone, saw the doctor, listened to his examination with her heart in her throat. Well, Mrs. Hale, he said, smiling. Congratulations. You're going to have a baby. Mara sat in his office for 10 minutes after he left, just breathing, trying to absorb it. A baby. After all this time, all the worry, all the fear. A baby. She rode home in a daze. Gideon was in the barn when she got back, working on a saddle that needed mending. He looked up when she came in. How was town? She couldn't speak, could only smile, tears streaming down her face. Gideon dropped the saddle. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She laughed through the tears. Nothing's wrong. I'm pregnant. He stared at her. What? I'm pregnant. The doctor confirmed it. We're going to have a baby. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen. Then he crossed the barn in 3 strides and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around, laughing. A baby! We're having a baby! We're having a baby, she confirmed, and they held each other and cried and laughed and didn't care who saw. That night, lying in bed with Gideon's hand resting on her still flat stomach, Mara thought about the year that had passed, about the widow she'd been, starving and desperate and alone, about the marriage of convenience that had become something real. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For riding onto my land that day, for offering me a future, for being patient, for everything. Gideon kissed her temple. Thank you for saying yes, for giving me a chance, for making this a home instead of just a house. Outside, an early winter wind rattled the windows, but inside they were warm, safe, together. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mara wasn't afraid of what was coming. She was ready. The joy lasted exactly 3 weeks. Mara was in the kitchen making bread when the nausea hit harder than usual. She barely made it outside before she was sick, retching until there was nothing left but dry heaves. Gideon found her leaning against the porch post, pale and shaking. That's the 3rd time today, he said, worry creasing his face. Maybe we should get the doctor out here. It's normal. The doctor said it would pass after the first few months. It's getting worse, not better. She wanted to argue, but another wave of nausea silenced her. Gideon helped her back inside, settled her in a chair, brought water she couldn't keep down. That night, lying in bed trying to find a position that didn't make her stomach rebel, Mara heard the rider arrive. Hoofbeats fast and urgent, then voices outside. Gideon's low rumble and another man, higher pitched, agitated. Gideon came into the bedroom, his face strange in the lamplight. What is it? Mara asked. That was Miller from the county seat. There's trouble. He sat on the edge of the bed. That lawyer, the one who helped us with the Briggs situation, he's been asking questions, digging into the old land records. Mara's stomach clenched, and not from the pregnancy. Why? Because apparently Briggs wasn't working alone. There's a whole network of them. Land speculators, corrupt officials, forged documents. They've been stealing property all over the territory for years. He rubbed his face. And they found something about your ranch, about the original deed. What about it? There's a discrepancy. When Thomas bought the land, the seller was a man named Whitaker. But according to the county records, Whitaker never owned that property. Someone else did, a woman named Elizabeth Garrett. She died 10 years ago, and the land should have gone to her heirs. The room tilted. What does that mean? It means the sale might not have been legal. If Whitaker didn't have the right to sell, then Thomas's purchase was invalid, which means the deed you're holding, the one in your name now, might be worthless. No. The word came out flat. No, that can't be right. Thomas was careful. He wouldn't have. Thomas was a homesteader trying to build a life, same as everyone else. He probably had no idea Whitaker was lying. Gideon took her hand. The lawyer says there are heirs making noise, real heirs. They want the land back. Mara pulled her hand away, pressed it to her mouth. The land. The ranch that had been her prison and her salvation. The place Thomas had died trying to keep. The foundation of everything she and Gideon had built together. Can they take it? I don't know. The lawyer's looking into it. But if the original sale was fraudulent... He didn't finish. Didn't need to. She thought about the grazing rights, the water access, the careful plans they'd made for spring. Thought about the money Gideon had already invested in fencing, in improving the property, in making it viable again. How much time do we have? Miller says the heirs are filing a claim within the week. After that, it goes to a judge. Could take months to settle. Or days, if the judge sees it's clear-cut fraud. Gideon didn't argue. Mara stood, went to the window. Outside, the October night was clear and cold. Stars scattered across black sky like someone had thrown diamonds at it, beautiful and utterly indifferent to human suffering. We'll lose everything, she said. Not everything. This house, this ranch. It's mine outright. We won't lose that. But the expansion, the plans. You were going to double the herd next year. You needed that land. I'll figure something out. She turned to face him. Don't pretend this isn't a disaster. I'm not pretending anything, but we've been through worse. Have we? Her voice rose. This isn't bad weather or sick cattle or even thieves we can punch in the face. This is the law. If a judge says that land isn't ours, it's not ours, and there's nothing we can do about it. Mara, I've ruined you. The words came out broken. Everything I brought to this marriage has been poison. Debts, fraud, legal troubles. You would have been better off if I'd frozen to death in that cabin. Don't you dare say that. It's true. You'd have your money, your plans, your future. Instead, you've got a sick wife and a baby you might not even be able to... Gideon crossed the room and grabbed her shoulders. Not rough, but firm enough to cut through the spiral. Listen to me. You are not poison. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. And yes, this is bad. It's terrible, but we'll handle it the same way we've handled everything else, together. How? How do we fight this? I don't know yet, but I'll find a way. His jaw set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. Nobody's taking anything from us, not without one hell of a fight. The next morning, Gideon rode to the county seat to meet with the lawyer. Mara stayed behind, too sick to travel, and spent the day trying not to fall apart. She threw up twice before noon. The smell of coffee made her gag. Even water tasted wrong. One of the ranch hands, a kid named Peter who couldn't be more than 17, knocked on the door around midday. Mrs. Hale? You all right? She must have looked awful. I'm fine. You don't look fine. Should I fetch someone? I'm pregnant, not dying. It just makes me sick sometimes. Peter's face went red. Oh, sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to. I'll just... He fled. Mara might have laughed if she had the energy. Instead, she went back to bed, pulled the quilt over her head, and tried to sleep. She woke to voices. Gideon was back, and he wasn't alone. She dragged herself out of bed, splashed water on her face, and went to see who it was. In the kitchen, Gideon sat at the table with 3 other men. She recognized one, the lawyer, Miller. The other 2 were strangers, older men, weathered and serious. "Mara." Gideon stood. "This is Judge Patterson and Mr. Hendricks. They're here about the land dispute." Her heart sank. "Already?" "Not a ruling," the judge said. His voice was gravelly but not unkind. "Just preliminary questions. We're trying to establish the facts before this goes any further." She sat down, feeling ambushed and unprepared. "What do you need to know?" For the next hour, they went over everything. When Thomas bought the land, how much he paid, what documentation he had. The judge took notes in a small leather book, his face giving nothing away. "And you had no knowledge of any irregularities in the sale?" he asked. "None. My husband handled all of that. I trusted him." "Did he ever mention Whitaker? Any concerns about the deed?" "No, never." The judge wrote something down. "Mrs. Hale, I want to be straight with you. This doesn't look good. The chain of title is broken. Whitaker had no legal right to sell that property, which means your husband's purchase and your subsequent ownership is built on sand." "But we didn't know," Mara said. "We acted in good faith. Surely that counts for something." "It does. But the law is the law. The Garrett heirs have a legitimate claim. If they can prove their grandmother owned that land, and all evidence suggests they can, then legally it's theirs." Gideon's hand found hers under the table, squeezed hard. "What if we buy it from them?" Mara asked. "The heirs. What if we offer to purchase the land at fair market value?" The judge exchanged a look with Hendricks. "You could try, but I suspect they'll want more than fair value, knowing you've already invested in the property." "How much more?" "Hard to say. Could be double, triple, even. They know you're in a bind." Gideon's jaw tightened. "That's extortion." "That's business," Hendricks said. He was a narrow man with cold eyes. "They have something you want. You'll pay what they ask or you'll lose it." "Who are these heirs?" Gideon demanded. "Where are they? I want to talk to them directly." "That's not advisable," Miller said quickly. "Let us handle the negotiations." "Why? So you can take your cut?" The lawyer flushed. "Mr. Hale, I'm trying to help you. Going in there angry isn't going to—" "I'm not angry. I'm realistic." Gideon stood. "You all know exactly what's happening here. This is another scheme. The Garrett heirs, if they even exist, are probably working with the same people who tried to steal the land before. They'll squeeze us for every penny, and when we can't pay, they'll take the land anyway." "That's a serious accusation," the judge said quietly. "Is it wrong?" Silence. The judge closed his book. "I'll make inquiries. See who these heirs are, where they came from. But Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale, prepare yourselves. Even in the best case, this is going to cost you. Heavily." After they left, Mara and Gideon sat at the table, not speaking. The lamp threw shadows on the walls. Outside, wind rattled the windows. "How much do we have?" Mara asked finally. "Maybe $1,000. If I sell half the herd and don't buy supplies for winter. And if they want triple the land value?" Gideon did the math in his head. She could see it in his eyes. "We'd need at least 2,000, maybe more." "We don't have it." "No." Mara stood, paced to the window. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, haggard, a woman being slowly crushed by circumstances beyond her control. "There has to be another way," she said. "If there is, I can't see it." She turned to face him. "What if we walk away? Let them have the land. We still have this ranch. We can rebuild. It would take years, and we'd be back where we started, barely scraping by, hoping nothing goes wrong." He shook his head. "I won't do that to you. I won't do that to our child." Our child. The baby she was carrying, the future they'd been building. "Then we fight," Mara said. "With what?" "I don't know. But you were right. I'm not giving up without a fight. We've come too far." Gideon looked at her, something like admiration in his tired eyes. "You're tougher than I am." I've had more practice losing. It makes you stubborn. He almost smiled. The next week was hell. The nausea got worse. Mara could barely keep food down, and what little she ate came back up within hours. She grew weaker, thinner, despite being pregnant. Gideon watched her with barely concealed fear. "You need to see the doctor again," he said one morning after she'd spent 20 minutes being sick. "We can't afford it." "I don't care what it costs. We need every penny for the land." "The land doesn't matter if you're too sick to stand." She wanted to argue, but another wave of nausea cut her off. When it passed, she was too exhausted to fight anymore. The doctor came the next day. He examined her, asked questions, took her pulse. His face grew more concerned as he worked. "Mrs. Hale, have you been under unusual stress lately?" Mara laughed, bitter. "You could say that. I'm concerned about the baby. This level of sickness isn't normal, and combined with stress..." He paused, choosing his words. "You need rest, complete rest. No work, no worry, nothing that taxes your body." "That's not possible." "Then you risk losing the child. I'm sorry to be blunt, but that's the reality." The words hit like a physical blow. "How long?" Gideon asked, his voice strained. "How long does she need to rest?" "Until the sickness passes." "Could be weeks, could be months. Every pregnancy is different." After the doctor left, Mara sat on the bed, hands on her still flat stomach, trying to process what she'd just heard. She could lose the baby. After everything they'd been through, after the miracle of conceiving at all, she could still lose it. Gideon knelt in front of her. "We'll do whatever it takes. I can't just lie in bed for months. The ranch will survive. The men know what to do, and I'll handle the rest. And the land dispute? I'll handle that too. You can't do everything alone." "Watch me." He took her hands. "Mara, nothing matters more than you and this baby. Nothing. If we lose the land, we lose the land. I can live with that, but I can't live with losing you." The tears came then, hot and helpless. "I'm so tired of being weak." "You're the strongest person I know, but even the strong need help sometimes." She let him hold her, let herself lean on him for once, instead of trying to carry everything herself. The days blurred together. Mara stayed in bed, eating what little she could, sleeping fitfully. Gideon brought her meals, sat with her in the evenings, pretended everything was fine, even though she could see the strain in every line of his face. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. And then, on a gray November morning, the letter came. Gideon brought it to her, his face unreadable. "It's from the Garrett heir's lawyer." Mara sat up slowly. "What does it say?" He opened it, read silently. His expression grew darker with each line. "They want $3,000, cash, within 30 days. The number was absurd, impossible. "Or what?" Mara asked, though she already knew. "Or they take possession of the land and everything on it, including the improvements we've made. We can't pay that." "No. Can we borrow it?" "From who? The banks won't lend to us, not with this cloud over the title. And even if they would, we couldn't pay it back." Mara felt something break inside her. "So we lose." "There might be another option." Gideon's voice was carefully neutral. "I could sell this ranch, all of it. The land, the cattle, everything. It would fetch enough to pay them off and buy your ranch free and clear." She stared at him. "You can't be serious. It's your land. Your legacy from Thomas. You should have it. At the cost of everything you've built, everything you are?" She shook her head. "No, absolutely not. Mara, this ranch is your life. You were born on this land. Your parents are buried here. I won't let you throw that away for a piece of property that's brought us nothing but trouble. It's not just property. It's your connection to your first husband, your past." "My past is dead. My future is you." She grabbed his hand. "Thomas would understand. He'd want me to let it go if it meant keeping you." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." We let them have it. We walk away. He closed his eyes, and she saw the relief wash over him even as something else, something like grief, crossed his face. "All right. I'll contact the lawyer tomorrow." That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, thinking about the ranch she was giving up. Not the land itself, she'd stopped caring about that months ago, but what it represented. The last piece of Thomas, the last proof that he'd existed, that their life together had been real. Letting it go felt like burying him all over again. But this time, she was ready. The next morning, before Gideon could ride to town, another visitor arrived. It was Miller, the lawyer, and he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a woman, middle-aged, severe, dressed in expensive traveling clothes that looked out of place in the frontier morning. "Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale," Miller said. "This is Mrs. Margaret Garrett Pierce. She's one of the heirs." The woman dismounted with practiced ease and looked at them with sharp, assessing eyes. "I wanted to see the property before we finalized anything." Gideon's jaw tightened. "See it all you want. We're not paying your extortion." "It's not extortion. It's fair compensation for land that's rightfully mine." "Fair?" Gideon's voice was hard. "You want 3 times what it's worth." "I want what I'm owed. Your wife's husband stole this land from my family. You've profited from that theft. Now it's time to make it right." Mara stepped forward, ignoring the dizziness that came with moving too fast. "Thomas didn't steal anything. He bought that land in good faith from a man who claimed to own it. If he was lied to, that's not his fault." Mrs. Garrett Pierce's expression didn't soften. "Intent doesn't matter. The law is clear." "Then take us to court. Let a judge decide." "I'd rather settle this privately, but if you prefer a lengthy legal battle you can't afford." She shrugged. They were trapped, and everyone knew it. "I want to see the property," Mrs. Garrett Pierce said. "All of it. Then we'll discuss terms." Gideon looked at Mara. She nodded slightly. They had nothing left to lose. The 4 of them rode to the disputed land. Mara stayed behind, too weak to travel, while Gideon went with the lawyer and Mrs. Garrett Pierce. He was gone for hours. When he came back, his face was strange. "What happened?" Mara asked. "She walked every acre, checked every improvement, wrote things down in a little notebook." He paused, and then she said the strangest thing. "What?" "She said her grandmother would have liked what we'd done with the place. Said Elizabeth Garrett was a practical woman who appreciated hard work." Mara didn't understand. "So?" "So then she said she needed to think about her decision, that she'd contact us within the week." Gideon shook his head. "Something's off. I can't figure out what, but something's not right about this whole situation." 3 days later, the answer came. Miller arrived with a letter. Not from Mrs. Garrett Pierce, from a different lawyer entirely, one in San Francisco. Gideon read it aloud, his voice growing more incredulous with each sentence. The Garrett heirs weren't trying to steal their land. They were trying to expose the fraud. Elizabeth Garrett's real descendants had been searching for years for properties their grandmother had owned, properties that had been stolen through forged documents and corrupt officials, the same network that had tried to defraud Mara before. Mrs. Garrett Pierce's aggressive approach had been a test. She'd wanted to see how they'd react, whether they'd known about the fraud, whether they were part of it. The letter concluded with an offer. The Garrett family would sell Mara and Gideon the land for the original purchase price Thomas had paid, $150. In exchange, they wanted help identifying other victims of the fraud network. Mara listened in stunned silence. $150, Gideon repeated. "We have that. We can pay that." "Why?" Mara asked. "Why would they do this?" "Because they're not thieves. They're just trying to clean up the mess their grandmother's property became after she died." He looked at the letter again. And because Mrs. Garrett Pierce wrote something else, personal, at the bottom. He handed it to Mara. In neat, slanted handwriting, it said, "My grandmother homesteaded alone after her husband died. She would have understood your fight. Good luck with the baby." Mara's eyes filled. They weren't losing the land. They were keeping it for $150 and the promise to help others. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Gideon pulled her into his arms. "We did." But even as relief flooded through her, Mara felt something else, a sharp, sudden pain low in her belly. She gasped. Gideon pulled back. "What's wrong?" Another pain, worse this time, and then warmth between her legs. She looked down. Blood. No, she breathed. No, no, no. Gideon saw it too. His face went white. I'll get the doctor. There's no time. Mara! The pain hit again, doubling her over. She grabbed the edge of the table, fighting to stay upright. The baby, she managed. Something's wrong with the baby. Gideon caught her before she hit the floor. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, carried her to the bedroom, his face a mask of controlled terror. Mara clutched at his shirt, the pain coming in waves now, each one worse than the last. Don't leave me, she gasped. I'm not going anywhere. He laid her on the bed, grabbed towels from the cupboard. But I need to get help. You're bleeding too much. The baby... I know. His voice cracked. Just hold on, please. He ran outside. She heard him shouting for Peter, heard the thunder of hoofbeats as the boy rode for town. Then Gideon was back, kneeling beside the bed, his hands shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding. I don't know what to do, he said, and the helplessness in his voice was worse than the pain. Mara, I don't know how to fix this. She reached for his hand, gripped it hard. You can't fix everything. I should be able to fix this. Another contraction tore through her. She cried out, couldn't help it. Gideon's face went gray. The next hour was a blur of pain and blood and fear. Gideon stayed with her, talking to her, trying to keep her conscious. She heard herself making sounds she didn't recognize, animal sounds, desperate and raw. When the doctor finally arrived, Mara was barely aware of it. She felt hands examining her, heard voices discussing things she couldn't follow. The pain had become everything, a red wall she couldn't see past. How far along is she? The doctor asked. 3 months, maybe 4. The pregnancy's failing. I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do to stop it. What about Mara? She's lost a lot of blood. The next few hours will tell. Gideon's hand tightened on hers. She's going to make it. She has to. The doctor didn't answer. Time stopped meaning anything. Mara drifted in and out, sometimes aware of Gideon's presence, sometimes lost in darkness. She felt her body expelling the pregnancy, felt the grief of it even through the physical agony. The baby they'd wanted, the future they'd imagined. Gone. At some point, the bleeding slowed. The pain began to recede, leaving behind a hollowness that was almost worse. Mara opened her eyes to find Gideon still beside her, his face haggard, his eyes red. Hey, he said softly. Is it over? He nodded. The doctor says you're going to be okay. You just need to rest. The baby? His expression answered before his words did. I'm so sorry. Mara turned her face to the wall. She didn't have the energy to cry. Didn't have the energy for anything except the weight of loss settling over her like a blanket made of stone. Gideon stayed with her through the night. When she finally slept, it was a black, dreamless thing that offered no comfort. She woke to gray morning light in an empty bed. For a moment, she didn't remember. Then it all came rushing back and she had to press her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Gideon appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray. You need to eat something. I'm not hungry. You need to eat anyway. He set the tray on the bedside table. Broth, bread, water. Simple things. Please, Mara. She took the broth to make him stop looking at her like that. It tasted like nothing. She managed 3 spoonfuls before her stomach rebelled. That's enough, Gideon said, taking the bowl. You did good. I didn't do anything good. I couldn't even keep our baby alive. That's not your fault. Whose fault is it then? The stress? The doctor said the stress could hurt the baby, and I didn't rest. I didn't stop. Gideon's voice was firm. This isn't on you. The doctor said these things happen. Sometimes there's no reason. There's always a reason. Then the reason is life is cruel and random, and sometimes it takes things from us for no good reason at all. He sat on the edge of the bed. But you're alive. That's what matters. Is it? She heard the bitterness in her own voice. I can't give you children. First with Thomas, now with you. There's something wrong with me. You don't know that. I do know that. My body just told me that in the clearest way possible. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, then he stood and left the room. Mara lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd finally pushed him too far, wondering if he was realizing what a mistake he'd made marrying a broken woman who couldn't give him the family he wanted. He came back carrying something, the quilt from the other bedroom, Thomas's quilt, the one her mother had made. "What are you doing?" Mara asked. He spread it over her. "You said you were cold." She hadn't said that, but she was cold, had been cold since she woke up. Gideon sat beside her again. "When Sarah died, my first wife, I blamed myself for months. If I'd gotten her to the doctor sooner, if I'd hired a midwife from town instead of relying on the neighbor woman, if I'd been a better husband, more attentive, less focused on the ranch." He paused. "It took me a long time to understand that some things are just beyond our control, that blame doesn't bring anyone back. But you wanted this baby. I wanted you to be safe. That's what I wanted most. That's not true." "It is true." He took her hand. "Mara, listen to me. I love you. I married you because I love you, not because I needed you to give me children. Yes, I wanted a family. I still do. But I want you more. And if we never have children, if it's just us for the rest of our lives, that's enough. You're enough." The tears came then, hot and helpless. Gideon pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried for the baby she'd lost, for the future that had been taken, for the unfairness of it all. The days that followed were gray and endless. Mara stayed in bed, not because the doctor ordered it, but because she couldn't find a reason to get up. Gideon brought her meals she barely touched, sat with her in the evenings, reading aloud from the newspaper, even though she didn't listen, held her at night when the grief became too much to bear alone. A week passed, then 2. The ranch continued without her. The cattle were moved to winter pasture. The last of the hay was stored. Preparations for the cold months went on with mechanical efficiency. Gideon handled it all, working from dawn to dark, then coming home to sit with a wife who could barely speak to him. One morning, Mara woke to voices in the kitchen. Women's voices. She got up slowly, pulled on a robe, and went to investigate. 3 women sat at her kitchen table. She recognized one, Martha Hayes, who lived on the ranch to the east. The others were strangers. They all looked up when she appeared. "Mrs. Hale," Martha said, standing. "We heard what happened. We wanted to come by, see if you needed anything." Mara stood in the doorway, feeling exposed and raw. "I'm fine. Of course you are." Martha's voice was kind but firm. "But we brought food anyway. Casseroles, bread, preserves, things that'll keep." One of the other women, younger, with a baby on her hip, smiled tentatively. "I'm Ann Crowley. My husband works for Mr. Hale sometimes. I lost a baby last year. I know how hard it is." The third woman nodded. "Sarah Mitchell. I lost 2 before I finally carried 1 to term. It's not something you get over, but it does get easier to carry." Mara felt something crack inside her. These women, these near strangers, had come because they understood, because they'd been here too. "Thank you," she managed. They stayed for an hour talking about nothing and everything. They didn't push her to speak, didn't offer empty platitudes. They just sat with her, a circle of women who knew what it meant to lose something precious before it had a chance to live. After they left, Mara found herself in the kitchen, looking at the food they'd brought, enough to feed them for weeks, acts of kindness from people she barely knew. Gideon came in from the barn. He saw the food, saw her standing there, and raised his eyebrows. "Martha Hayes and some other women," Mara explained. "They brought all this. That was kind of them. They all lost babies too. They told me about it. Like it was this normal thing that happens, and you just keep going. It is normal. Doesn't make it hurt less, but it happens more than people talk about." Mara picked up one of the casseroles. "We should eat this while it's still good." It was the first interest she'd shown in anything in 2 weeks. Gideon smiled. "I'll heat it up." They ate together that night. The food was good, rich, and hearty. Mara managed to eat more than she had in days. Afterward, instead of going straight to bed, she sat in the front room while Gideon built up the fire. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the land dispute, The Garrett's offer. We never responded. I sent word that we'd take it, paid the $150 last week. She blinked. You did? You were in no condition to discuss it, and we couldn't afford to wait. The lawyer said it was fine, that you'd already agreed in principle. He paused. Was that wrong? No, that was right. I forgot about it entirely. You had other things on your mind. Mara looked at the fire. So we own both ranches now, officially. We do, for whatever that's worth. It's worth something. It means Thomas didn't die for nothing, that the work he did mattered. Gideon came and sat beside her. It did matter, and so does what we're doing now. She leaned against him. I want to try again. Try what? For a baby. I know it might not work. I know I might lose it again, but I want to try. He was quiet for a long time. Are you sure? The doctor said you need time to heal. I'll heal, and when I'm ready, I want to try. She looked up at him. Unless you don't want to anymore. I want whatever you want. If you want to try, we try. If you decide you don't, that's fine too. He kissed her forehead. There's no rush. We have time. But even as he said it, Mara felt the pressure of time passing. She was 27 years old. How many years did she have left where pregnancy was even possible? How many chances? The thought scared her more than the grief. Winter came early that year, hitting hard in mid-November. The first snow fell thick and fast, covering the world in white. Mara stood at the window and watched it accumulate, remembering the terror she'd felt last winter, trapped and starving and alone. This winter was different. The house was warm, the pantry was full, and she wasn't alone. Gideon came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. What are you thinking about? Last year, how different everything was. Better or worse? Better, so much better. She turned in his arms. Even with everything that's happened, it's still better. He smiled. Good. They spent the winter rebuilding, not just the ranch, but themselves. Mara slowly regained her strength, working alongside Gideon when she could, resting when she couldn't. They talked more than they had before, about Thomas and Sarah, about loss and fear and hope. They learned each other in new ways, deeper ways. And slowly, carefully, they began to try for another child. Months passed. Nothing happened. Mara tried not to let it devastate her, tried to remember what Gideon had said about being enough. But every month, when her bleeding came, she felt the failure a little deeper. Spring arrived with mud and promise, same as always. They moved the cattle, checked the calves, started planning for the season ahead. Life went on, indifferent to human grief. One afternoon in April, Mara was working in the garden when she heard riders approaching. She looked up to see Miller, the lawyer, along with Mrs. Garrett Pierce, and another man she didn't recognize. Gideon came out of the barn, saw them, and his expression hardened. What now? Miller dismounted. Nothing bad, I promise. Mrs. Garrett Pierce wanted to check on you both. And this is Detective Morrison from San Francisco. He's been investigating the land fraud network. The detective was a compact man with sharp eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Hale, thank you for agreeing to help with our investigation. The information you provided about Carson Briggs and the forged documents has been invaluable. We haven't done that much, Gideon said. You've done more than you know. We've identified 17 other victims so far, people who lost land to the same scheme. We're working to return their property and prosecute the people responsible. Mrs. Garrett Pierce stepped forward. I also wanted to see how the land was doing, if you're comfortable showing me. Mara wiped dirt from her hands. Of course. They walked the property together, all of it, both Gideon's original ranch and the land that had been Thomas's. Mrs. Garrett Pierce asked questions about their plans, their struggles, their hopes for the future. She seemed genuinely interested, not judgmental. At the old cabin, Thomas's cabin, they stopped. Mara hadn't been inside since marrying Gideon. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The windows were dark. This is where you lived before? Mrs. Garrett Pierce asked. Yes, with my first husband. It must be hard seeing it like this. Mara looked at the abandoned building. It's just a place. The life I had here is over. But the land remembers. My grandmother used to say that. Mrs. Garrett Pierce smiled. She believed land holds memory, that the work people do on it leaves an imprint. Then this land remembers struggle. It remembers survival. That's not nothing. They walked back to the main house. The detective had more questions about dates and documents. Mara answered what she could, Gideon filling in the rest. It took hours, going through everything they knew about Briggs and the fraudulent debt, the forged loan papers, the network of corrupt officials. When they finally left, Mara was exhausted. That's done, at least, Gideon said. Is it? Feels like it'll never really be over. Morrison says they're close to making arrests. Once that happens, the whole thing collapses. Mara wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that justice actually worked, that bad people faced consequences. But she'd seen too much to trust in easy endings. 2 weeks later, word came that Briggs and 3 others had been arrested. The charges were extensive: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The trial would take months, but the prosecutor was confident. The news should have felt like victory. Instead, Mara just felt tired. She was in the kitchen making bread when the dizziness hit. One moment she was kneading dough, the next the room was spinning. She grabbed the counter, trying to stay upright. Gideon found her there, white-faced and shaking. What's wrong? I don't know, just got dizzy all of a sudden. He helped her to a chair. When did you last eat? This morning, I think. She tried to remember. Maybe yesterday? Mara. I haven't been hungry. He brought her bread and water, watched her eat. The dizziness faded but didn't entirely disappear. That night, it happened again. And the next morning. By the 3rd day, Mara knew. She'd felt this before. The dizziness, the nausea that wasn't quite nausea, the strange fatigue that came out of nowhere. She rode to town alone, saw the doctor, listened to his examination with her heart in her throat. Congratulations, Mrs. Hale. You're pregnant again. The words should have brought joy. Instead, she felt terror. How far along? Maybe 6 weeks. It's early yet. Too early. Far too early to feel safe. What are the chances, she asked, of losing it again? The doctor's face was kind. There's always risk, but nothing in your history suggests you can't carry a pregnancy to term. The miscarriage was likely just bad luck. Bad luck. As if that made it better. She rode home in a daze. Gideon was in the barn when she got back. She stood in the doorway, trying to find words. He looked up, saw her expression, and went still. What happened? I'm pregnant. For a moment he just stared. Then he crossed to her in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. That's good, he said fiercely. That's good news. Is it? What if I lose this one too? Then we'll grieve and try again. But Mara, you can't live in fear of what might happen. You'll drive yourself crazy. I'm already crazy. He pulled back to look at her. You're scared. That's different, and that's normal. I don't know if I can do this. Go through it all again. You don't have to do it alone. I'm right here. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this time would be different. But the fear sat in her chest like a stone. The next weeks were agony. Every twinge, every moment of nausea, every small pain sent Mara into panic. She couldn't eat without wondering if she was eating wrong, couldn't work without fearing she was working too hard, couldn't sleep without nightmares of blood and loss. Gideon watched her deteriorate with helpless frustration. You need to rest, he said one night after finding her pacing the kitchen at 2 a.m. I can't rest. Every time I close my eyes, I see, I know, but you're going to make yourself sick. I'm already sick. I'm sick with fear. He pulled her into his arms. Then be sick with me. Let me carry some of this. How? How do I do that? By talking to me instead of carrying it all inside. By letting me help instead of shutting me out. She realized with a shock that she had been shutting him out, trying to protect him from her terror, or maybe trying to protect herself from depending on him too much. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be sorry. Just talk to me. So she did. She told him about the nightmares, about the constant fear, about how every day felt like waiting for disaster. He listened without judgment, holding her while she cried, offering comfort when there was nothing else to offer. The weeks turned into months. The pregnancy continued. Mara grew rounder, the baby becoming visible proof of life growing inside her. But the fear never entirely left. In her 5th month, she felt the baby move for the first time. A flutter, like butterfly wings against her ribs. She was alone in the kitchen, and the sensation was so unexpected she gasped. When Gideon came in, she grabbed his hand and placed it on her stomach. Wait, just wait. They stood there for 5 minutes before it happened again. A tiny kick, barely perceptible. Gideon's face transformed. Was that? That was the baby. He knelt down, pressed his ear to her stomach. Hey there, little one. We've been waiting for you. Mara's eyes filled. Don't get too attached yet. Something could still... Stop. He looked up at her. I know you're scared, but this baby is alive right now, and we're going to celebrate that, not spend every moment waiting for the worst. He was right. She knew he was right, but knowing didn't make it easier. The months crawled by. Summer came, hot and bright. The ranch thrived. The cattle multiplied. The land they'd fought so hard to keep produced grass and life and hope. And Mara's belly grew round with the child she desperately wanted, but was terrified to love. In her 8th month, the contractions started. Mara was hanging laundry when the first contraction hit. Not the gentle practice ones she'd been feeling for weeks, but something sharp and unmistakable. She dropped the shirt she was holding and gripped the clothesline, breathing through it. Too early. She was only 8 months. The baby wasn't supposed to come yet. The contraction passed. She stood there, hand on her belly, waiting. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just her body preparing, like the doctor said it would. 10 minutes later, another one came. Stronger this time. Mara walked slowly back to the house, trying to stay calm. Gideon was out with the hands, moving cattle to the far pasture. He wouldn't be back until evening. She made it inside before the 3rd contraction doubled her over. This was real. This was happening. She managed to get to the bedroom, grabbed the edge of the bed as another wave of pain rolled through her. When it passed, she called out for Peter. The boy was supposed to be fixing fence near the barn. No answer. Another contraction. Harder, faster than the last. Mara realized with cold clarity that she was alone, completely alone. And the baby was coming whether she was ready or not. She got herself onto the bed, tried to remember everything the doctor had told her. Stay calm. Breathe. Don't push too early. Easy things to say when you weren't terrified and in pain and facing the possibility that you might die bringing this baby into the world. The contractions came faster. She lost track of time, lost track of everything except the pain and the need to survive it. She heard herself making sounds she didn't recognize, animal sounds that belonged to some primitive part of her brain that knew only birth and blood and survival. At some point, minutes or hours later, she couldn't tell, she heard hoofbeats. Then Gideon's voice shouting her name. He burst into the bedroom, took one look at her, and went pale. How long? He demanded. I don't know. An hour? 2? He was already moving, gathering towels, water, everything he could think of. I'll send Peter for the doctor. There's no time. Mara... Another contraction cut her off. This one was different, deeper. Her body was telling her to push and she couldn't fight it anymore. Gideon saw it in her face. All right. We can do this. You don't know how. Neither do you. We'll figure it out together. He washed his hands in the basin, came to the bed. Tell me what you need. I need this to be over. I need the baby to be okay. The urge to push overwhelmed everything else. What followed was messy and terrifying and nothing like the calm, controlled births she'd imagined. There was blood and pain and moments where she was certain she couldn't do this, couldn't survive it. Gideon stayed with her through all of it, his hands steady even when his face showed his terror, talking to her in a low, constant stream of encouragement and love. You're doing it. You're so strong. Just a little more. I can see the head. Keep going. Don't stop. You're amazing. I love you. Keep going. And then, with one final push that tore a scream from her throat, the baby came. For one horrible second, there was silence. Then a cry split the air, thin and reedy, but unmistakably alive. Gideon caught the baby, his hand shaking so badly Mara feared he'd drop it. But he didn't. He wrapped the tiny body in a clean towel, did something to clear its airways, and then placed the baby on Mara's chest. A girl. They had a daughter. She was small, too small, her skin red and wrinkled, her eyes squeezed shut against the unfamiliar world. But she was breathing, moving, very much alive. Mara touched the baby's face with trembling fingers, unable to believe she was real. "We did it," Gideon said, his voice breaking. "You did it!" The doctor arrived an hour later to find them like that. Mara exhausted and tearful in bed, the baby nursing awkwardly at her breast. Gideon sitting beside them both looking like he'd been through a war. The doctor checked them over with professional efficiency. "Baby's small but healthy, lungs are good, reflexes are good. She came early but not dangerously so." He looked at Mara. "You did well. Better than most women facing their first birth alone." "She wasn't alone," Gideon said quietly. The doctor smiled. "No, I suppose she wasn't." After he left, Mara and Gideon just stared at their daughter, still not quite believing she existed. "We need to name her," Gideon said eventually. They'd talked about names before, in careful whispers like speaking them too loud might jinx everything. Now those conversations seemed like they'd happened in another lifetime. "What about Hope?" Mara suggested, "because she gave us hope when we didn't have any." Gideon considered this. "Hope Vance Hale. You want to use Thomas's name?" "He's part of this story too, part of what brought us here. Seems right to honor that." Mara's eyes filled. "Hope Vance Hale, I like it." The baby, Hope, made a small sound and nuzzled against Mara's chest, already rooting for food she'd just finished eating. Mara laughed, the sound shaky but real. "She's hungry. She's stubborn, like her mother, and strong-willed, like her father. Heaven help us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter sleep. Outside, the summer evening was golden and warm. The ranch continued its rhythms, cattle calling, horses moving in the pasture, the ordinary sounds of a life well lived. The first weeks with Hope were harder than Mara had imagined. The baby cried constantly, slept in unpredictable bursts, and seemed to need feeding every hour. Mara was exhausted beyond anything she'd experienced, her body still recovering from the birth, her emotions raw and overwhelming. Gideon helped where he could, but there were some things only Mara could do. She spent hours walking the floor with a screaming infant, trying every trick the neighbor women had suggested, feeling like a failure when nothing worked. One night, 3 weeks after the birth, Mara sat in the rocking chair at 2 a.m. with Hope wailing in her arms. She'd tried feeding her, changing her, rocking her, singing to her. Nothing helped. "I don't know what you want," Mara said, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just tell me what you want." Gideon appeared in the doorway, rumpled from sleep. "Give her to me. You need to rest. You have work tomorrow. So do you. Give her to me." Mara handed over the screaming baby, watched as Gideon settled her against his shoulder and started walking slow circles around the room. Hope's cries began to quiet. "How did you do that?" "I didn't do anything." She was ready to calm down. "She's been crying for 2 hours." Then she needed to cry for 2 hours. He looked at Mara. "You're too hard on yourself. You think you're supposed to fix everything instantly, make everything perfect. But babies don't work that way. Sometimes they just need to cry it out." "I hate hearing her cry." "I know, but she's fed, she's clean, she's safe. That's all she needs. The crying won't hurt her." Hope had fallen asleep against his chest, her tiny fist curled against his shirt. "You're better at this than I am," Mara said quietly. "I'm not better. I'm just less tired. Go to bed. I'll walk with her for a while." Mara wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. She stumbled to bed and fell asleep before her head hit the pillow. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window, and Hope was in the cradle beside the bed, sleeping peacefully. Gideon was already gone, out doing the morning work. Mara looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside. This tiny person with her father's strong chin and her mother's dark hair. This impossible miracle that had survived when Mara had been certain everything would fall apart. She wasn't perfect at this. She was tired and scared and making it up as she went along. But Hope was alive and healthy, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The summer stretched on. Hope grew from a tiny, wrinkled newborn into a baby with round cheeks and curious eyes. She started smiling at 6 weeks, a gummy grin that made all the sleepless nights worth it. Started reaching for things, making sounds that weren't quite words but weren't just crying either. Mara found her rhythm, learned to read the different cries, figured out what worked and what didn't. The neighbor women came by regularly bringing food and advice and the kind of practical help that made all the difference. Martha Hayes taught her how to make a sling that let her carry Hope and still have her hands free. Ann Crowley showed her tricks for getting the baby to sleep. Sarah Mitchell just sat with her during the hard afternoons and talked about nothing important, giving Mara adult conversation when she desperately needed it. One afternoon in late August, Mrs. Garrett Pierce arrived unannounced. Mara was in the kitchen trying to cook dinner one-handed while Hope fussed in the sling. "Mrs. Hale," the older woman said from the doorway, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Come in." Mrs. Garrett Pierce entered, looked at Hope with undisguised interest. "So this is the baby I've heard about. This is Hope. She's beautiful." The older woman came closer. "May I?" Mara transferred Hope to Mrs. Garrett Pierce's arms. The baby studied the stranger with solemn eyes, then reached up and grabbed a handful of her hair. Mrs. Garrett Pierce laughed. "Strong grip. She'll be a rancher like her parents. If she survives her parents' ignorance first. I have no idea what I'm doing. None of us do. We just pretend very convincingly." She bounced Hope gently. "I came to tell you that the trial concluded. Briggs and his associates were all found guilty. They're going to prison for a long time." Mara felt a weight lift that she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "Good. More than good. The prosecution used your testimony, yours and your husband's, as the cornerstone of their case. Without you, those men would still be stealing land from families who can't fight back. We just told the truth. The truth is powerful, especially when people are brave enough to speak it." Mrs. Garrett Pierce handed Hope back. "My grandmother's land is finally clear. All the fraudulent claims have been dismissed. The rightful owners are being restored their property. You were part of making that happen." After she left, Mara stood at the window watching dust settle on the road. She thought about all the families who'd lost their homes, their futures, to men who saw them as nothing more than opportunities for profit. Thought about how close she'd come to being permanently broken by it, but she'd fought. She and Gideon had fought together, and they'd won. Not just for themselves, but for people they'd never meet. That evening, Gideon came in to find Mara nursing Hope in the rocking chair, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. That's the problem. I keep waiting for it to fall apart." He knelt beside the chair. "It's not going to fall apart. You don't know that. I know that we've survived everything thrown at us so far. Bad winters, fraud, grief, fear. We've survived all of it, and we're not just surviving anymore. We're living, building something that matters. I'm scared I'll mess it up, that I'll fail her somehow. You won't. How do you know? Because I know you. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived alone when you shouldn't have been able to. You married a stranger to save your life. You lost a baby and found the courage to try again. You gave birth without a doctor because you didn't have a choice. You're not going to fail her, Mara. You're going to show her what strength looks like." Hope finished nursing and made a small, satisfied sound. Mara lifted her to her shoulder, patted her back until she burped. "I never thought I'd have this," Mara said quietly. "After Thomas died, I thought my life was over, that I'd just exist until I didn't anymore. And now? Now I have more than I ever imagined. A husband I love, a daughter, a future that's actually worth living." She looked at him. "I have you." Gideon touched her face. "You've always had me, since the moment you showed up at my door and demanded conditions for a marriage of convenience. Best decision I ever made. Second best. The best was saying yes when I asked in the first place." They smiled at each other, Hope sleeping between them, and Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just contentment or relief or even happiness. Peace. Fall came with its usual rush of work. The cattle had to be moved. The hay had to be stored. Everything had to be prepared for winter. Mara worked where she could, Hope strapped to her back or sleeping in a basket near whatever task needed doing. She was slower now, more careful, but she was still capable, still strong. One morning in October, Mara rode out to the old ranch, Thomas's ranch, though she'd stopped thinking of it that way. It was just land now, good grazing land that supported their expanded herd. She stopped at the cabin. Someone, probably Gideon, had finally fixed the door, patched the worst of the holes. It wasn't livable, but it wasn't falling down either. Mara dismounted, went inside. The cabin was empty except for dust and memories. She stood in the middle of the single room and thought about the woman who'd lived here once, the desperate, grieving widow who'd been ready to die rather than admit defeat. That woman felt like a stranger now. Mara touched the wall, the rough wood that Thomas had cut and fitted with his own hands. He'd loved her in his way, built this place for their future, worked himself to death, trying to make it succeed. "I'm sorry I couldn't save it," she said out loud. "But I saved myself. I think you would have wanted that." The cabin didn't answer. But standing there, Mara felt something release inside her chest. Permission, maybe. To let go of the guilt she'd carried for moving on, for finding happiness with another man, for building a life that didn't include Thomas. He was gone. Had been gone for years. And she was allowed to live anyway. She left the cabin and rode back to Gideon's ranch, their ranch, where Hope was probably awake and hungry, and Gideon was dealing with whatever crisis the day had brought. Home. This was home now. Winter came, but this time Mara faced it without fear. The house was warm, the stores were full, and she had Gideon and Hope and a future that stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. Hope grew through the cold months, changing almost daily. She learned to roll over, then to sit up, then to crawl. By the time spring arrived, she was pulling herself up on furniture, determined to walk despite the falls that left her crying in frustration. "She's stubborn," Gideon said one evening, watching Hope try and fail for the 20th time to take a step without holding on. "I wonder where she gets that." "Definitely from you." "Liar." Hope fell again, this time staying down. She looked up at her parents with betrayed outrage, lower lip trembling. Gideon scooped her up. "It's all right, little one. You'll get it. Just takes practice." Hope buried her face in his shoulder, then peeked out at Mara and smiled. "Manipulative too," Mara observed. "Also from you." She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it one-handed, laughing. These were the moments Mara treasured. The ordinary, unremarkable moments of being a family. Dinner together, bath time, reading stories before bed even though Hope was too young to understand them. The rhythm of daily life that she'd once thought she'd lost forever. One evening in May, a writer arrived with news. Detective Morrison from San Francisco with updates on the fraud case. He sat at their kitchen table and laid out everything that had happened since the trial. "We've recovered nearly $200,000 in stolen land and property," he said, "returned it to the rightful owners, and we've identified another dozen officials who were part of the network. They're all facing charges." "That's incredible," Gideon said. "It wouldn't have happened without you. Your testimony opened the door for other victims to come forward, people who'd been too scared or too ashamed to speak up before." Mara thought about all those families, all those people who'd been crushed by forces beyond their control. Are they getting their land back? Most of them. Some cases are more complicated, but we're working through them. Morrison pulled out an envelope. The state legislature voted to create a victims' compensation fund. They wanted to give something to the people who helped break the case open. "This is yours." Gideon opened the envelope. Inside was a bank draft for $500. They stared at it. "That's too much," Mara said. "It's not nearly enough for what you went through, but it's what they authorized." Morrison stood. "Use it however you want. You've earned it." After he left, Mara and Gideon looked at each other. $500, Gideon said. "What do we do with it?" "Whatever we want, I guess." They talked about it for days. They could use it to buy more cattle, expand the herd, could invest in new equipment, make the ranch more efficient, could save it for Hope's future, for school or marriage or whatever she needed years from now. In the end, they did something else. They gave half to the neighbor families who'd helped them through the hard times. Martha Hayes got new fencing for her struggling ranch. Ann Crowley got money for a doctor after her husband was injured. Sarah Mitchell got supplies for the baby she was carrying. The rest they saved, not for themselves but for emergencies, for the next family facing disaster, for the next widow who needed help. "We know what it's like to need help," Mara said when Gideon questioned if they were being too generous. "We know what a difference it makes when people show up." He didn't argue, just pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. Summer arrived warm and bright. Hope took her first steps in June, stumbling across the kitchen into Mara's waiting arms. She spoke her first word in July, "Da," pointing at Gideon with absolute certainty. "What about Mama?" Mara asked, mock-offended. Hope just grinned and said "Da" again. Gideon was insufferably smug about it for days. In August, on the anniversary of Hope's birth, they had a small celebration. Just the three of them and a cake Mara had made that was lopsided but tasted good. Hope smashed her piece enthusiastically, getting more on her face than in her mouth. "She's perfect," Gideon said, watching their daughter destroy the cake with focused determination. "She's a mess." "That too." He looked at Mara. "Thank you." "For what?" "For saying yes when I asked, for fighting when it would have been easier to give up, for giving me this." He gestured at Hope, at the life they'd built. "For giving me everything." Mara felt her eyes fill. "I should be thanking you. You saved my life." "We saved each other." He was right. That's what they'd done. Two broken people finding each other at exactly the right moment, building something stronger from the pieces of what they'd lost. That night, after Hope was asleep, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The ranch was quiet, peaceful. Cattle moving in the distance, a coyote calling from the hills, the sounds of a world continuing its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human joy and sorrow. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Mara asked. "How so?" "If you hadn't ridden onto my land that day, if I'd refused your offer, if any of 100 things had gone differently." "Sometimes, but there's no point dwelling on it. This is what happened. This is what we made together." Mara leaned against him. "I'm glad you rode onto my land." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars, feeling the weight of everything they'd survived and the lightness of everything they'd gained. Inside, Hope made a small sound in her sleep. Mara started to get up, but Gideon stopped her. "She's fine. Just dreaming." "How do you know?" "Because I know our daughter, and I know when she needs us and when she's just making noise." Mara settled back down. He was right. Hope was fine. They were all fine. More than fine. The years that followed weren't perfect. There were hard seasons and sick cattle and times when money was tight. Hope got sick with a fever that scared them both until it broke. A drought one summer made them worry about water. Gideon broke his arm falling from a horse and couldn't work for weeks. But they faced it all together, and they kept building, not just the ranch, but a life. A real life. Full of the ordinary struggles and joys that make up a human existence. Hope grew into a strong, willful child who could ride almost before she could walk, who helped her father with the cattle and her mother in the garden, who asked 1,000 questions and never accepted "because I said so" as an answer. When she was 5, Mara discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there was less fear and more cautious hope. The pregnancy was easier, and in the spring, they welcomed a son. They named him Thomas Gideon Hale, honoring both the past and the present. Gideon cried when they told him the name. "You didn't have to do that, he said. "I wanted to. Thomas deserves to be remembered, and our son deserves to know where he came from." Their family grew, not just in numbers but in depth, in the roots they put down, in the community they built around them. They became the people others came to for help, the family with enough to share, with wisdom earned through suffering, with the kind of strength that only comes from surviving the unsurvivable. Mara never forgot what it felt like to be desperate and alone, never forgot the kindness of strangers who'd helped when they didn't have to. And she made sure her children knew those stories, understood that strength wasn't about never needing help. It was about having the courage to ask for it and the grace to give it. 10 years after that first desperate winter, Mara stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at the land they'd built. 2 children playing in the yard, cattle dotting the hillsides, fields green with growing things. A life that had seemed impossible once upon a time. Gideon came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how far we've come. About the woman I was when you first met me. I liked that woman. She was half dead and ready to give up. She was a survivor. She just didn't know it yet." He kissed her neck. "I saw it in her eyes. That's why I asked." "You asked because you needed a wife." "I asked because I saw someone worth saving, and because I thought maybe she could save me too." Mara turned in his arms. "Did I?" "Every day." They kissed there on the porch while their children played, and the ranch continued its work and the future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer terrifying. That night, lying in bed with Gideon's arm around her and the sounds of their children sleeping down the hall, Mara thought about survival, about how it wasn't just enduring, it was finding reasons to keep going, building something worth staying for. She'd thought once that she'd lost everything, that Thomas's death had taken her future along with his life. But she'd been wrong. The future wasn't something you lost. It was something you built, piece by piece, choice by choice. And sometimes the best futures came from the worst circumstances. Sometimes strength was born from desperation. Sometimes love grew in the spaces where you'd thought nothing could ever grow again. She'd survived that last winter alone. But she'd done more than survive the years that followed. She'd lived, really lived, with all the mess and pain and joy that came with it. And standing on the other side of all that suffering, Mara understood something fundamental about the human spirit. We're stronger than we think, more resilient than we know, capable of rebuilding even when everything's been destroyed. All we have to do is choose to try. Hope cried out in her sleep. Mara started to get up, but Gideon was already moving. "I've got her," he said. She listened to him padding down the hall, heard his low voice soothing their daughter back to sleep. Heard him check on Thomas, making sure the boy was covered. When he came back, he slid into bed and pulled Mara close. "Everything okay?" she murmured. "Everything's perfect." And lying there in the dark, safe and warm and loved, Mara had to agree. Not because their life was easy, it wasn't. Not because they had everything they wanted, they didn't. But because they had each other. Because they'd fought for this, and earned it, and refused to let go even when holding on seemed impossible. That was enough. That was everything. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the promise of another season, another year, another chance to build and grow and become. And inside, a family slept peacefully, dreaming of tomorrows they'd create together. The ranch they'd saved, the life they'd built, the future they'd claimed from the jaws of despair. It was theirs, earned through sacrifice and stubbornness and the kind of love that doesn't quit even when quitting would be easier. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything they'd fought for and more than they'd dared to hope. A new legacy. Built not on what they'd lost, but on what they'd had the courage to claim. Together. Always together.